In this demonstration, I'm going to talk about rendering bottle one in an opaque material. The other rendering demonstration was a clear PET or glass bottle with a translucent material on the inside, and then we had to build the geometry to make that happen. So it was a little bit more involved with building, but the rendering technique will be very similar. So again, it's going to be this relationship between this perspective in this display image size and the lighting, moving those arrows around and get the lighting in the right position. And then the materials, the materiality, selecting materials, what color, and then what kind of reflective quality that they have. So in this particular one, I picked this lavender color, sort of tied in with the graphics. No particular reason, it's just for demonstration purposes. And I made that relatively shiny. I'm actually put a metal reflector on it, and I'm going to show you how I did that instead of just plastic. And then I deliberately made the label and the closure very flat. So that's not very shiny at all, just so we can see the differences. So you can see all the white highlights and the level of contrast in the bottle versus the label and the closure. We still see a little bit of shading going on, but it's very subtle. So it's just a nice contrast between the two to have that look that way. And then, of course, you can see inside this oval area, I have this slight texture. That's not geometry. I didn't build that. That's another way of using texture maps. So I'm going to talk about how to do that also. So all of these things are going to come together. So since I did the rendering for the clear bottle in this file, I don't want to move my lights around. I kind of want to keep them the same. I could have started a whole nother file, brought this over, and then I would have the freedom to move that lighting and then leave the lighting alone. But I wanted to generate this relatively quickly in the same file. So I'm not moving my lights that much. So I'm going to talk about how that's going to work. So the lighting looks pretty good. I'm going to talk about it in this view, and then I'll show you how I did that. So we have this nice backlighting on the right-hand side. Since I'm turning the bottle slightly to the left, it's facing to the left, we're seeing this right side a little bit more than the other side, just a subtle amount. I actually changed that perspective slightly from the plastic bottle. So we have this nice backlighting here, which looks really nice. I have a pretty strong light coming in there, and it also has nice backlighting on the label, and of course up here on the closure. And then we have that dark shadow area inboard that really helps us see that this is coming around quite drastically around that corner. And then we have our medium color, and then we have our hot highlight over here on the left-hand side, sort of towards the center, but on the left side. And I have that almost shining completely white since I have this metal reflector on here. So that looks quite nice. And then, of course, we have our little highlights in this negative curved area, some backlighting over here. So all of that really works well. And then it looks great when you have the matte label on top of that. You can really see the difference in the materiality. One thing I would like to have on here that I don't, because I don't want to move the lighting around, it would be nice to have a bit of a lit area, almost like this backlight area on this side. It'd be nice to have that over on the left side also, just to bring that up all the way on that edge. It still looks really good, so I didn't make a big deal out of that, but that would have helped a lot. So let's go to here. I'm going to go front. So now I'm just in interactive shader, and I'm going to see our lights. So this one only has the three lights. So this works really well. So I don't have a light way up on the top shining down. I usually do, and that catches all our high points. So this light, I took it, I moved it down, and I'm looking more into the front. You see from the side view, this is my my top light, and that's shining in there. So that works really well. I do have a fourth light here. Let me check. Okay, here. So I did have a fourth light. There it is. Okay, that's my highlight. I did have that in there. Sorry, I thought I took that out. So that one shining straight down, that's catching all my high points, the high highlights on here, even inside of the dome. That I have shadows on, and that's what's going to give us our little shadow that we will see at the base of the bottle. The backlighting, I have two backlights. Since this is a curved shape, I have these two lights coming in from the back. One is low, shining in that bottom curve that curves underneath, and then the other one is a little bit higher, shining on that shoulder. So I wanted that backlight all the way. So let's look at this from the front view. So see this light down here? That's shining up and giving me that backlit area and also creating that dark contrast down the bottom because it's coming in from the back. And then this one is a little bit top of the shoulder. I moved this down slightly from the PET clear because the PET clear really shined very nicely when I had that a little bit higher. So here, I wanted to bring it down a little bit. It was a little bit too intense light on that backlight there. So I just moved that. That's the only movement I did on the lights from the PET demonstration. Okay, so that's it. So I could, let's move a light and I'll show you what happens. Just going to move this a little bit and then undo so we can start to look at this. Let's take this front light, which is giving me that highlight on the front. So let's just move that over. Move it just like an object. I'm going to grab just the tail. I'm just going to move that over a little bit like this. And then I'm going to go back to, where's my point of view? I'm going to bring up my views dialog. And this one I am using, I set up another perspective 2. Let me show you the difference. This was the point of view I had for the PET. I had it turned slightly. I saw a little bit more of the top and I turned it so I saw a little bit more of the side. I changed that slightly just for this one. So I'm going to perspective 2. I just moved it over ever so slightly and then moved it up so we can barely see the top. I just wanted to do that because it also helped me deal with my lighting on the side. So I moved that light. You can already see the highlight is almost right up the middle by using that light that I had just moved. So let's render that. So just by moving that, this highlight, this really hot highlight I have up in the front, that is now almost in dead center. It still works, but I preferred it over to the left-hand side so we can get that nice shaded area over here. So I'm going to undo that just to show you what the effect of some of those lights can do. Okay, undo. You can see it right here. It'll move over. See how it moves over? And it's now riding along that curve very nicely. So again, like I had mentioned, moving these lights around, it's a repetitive process. You move a little bit, you render, you take a look, you change the reflective qualities of the material, and it's a little bit of back and forth with all these different things. That's why when we set up this perspective, it's very important to maintain a consistent point of view, because as soon as you change that, the lighting will vary slightly. So once you pick one, for this one, I set up another one, I picked it, and I made my adjustments accordingly. I left most of my lights, I just made my adjustments just with the material. So let's talk about the texture mapping. Actually, let me go to my label and my closure. I'll show you what I did there. So this is the material I have for my closure. Instead of plastic, I put it on matte. So it reflects less light than on plastic. And I left everything the same. And so it's kind of just flat, but I added this glow. Glow just sort of brightens it up in general. It doesn't make the highlights any more intense. It just lightens it up. So when I had no glow on it, it looked kind of gray and dead. So I'm just adding a little bit of glow to pop that up a little bit. Again, you have to experiment with these things. And I did the exact same thing with the label. So the label has the same types of qualities. So I selected matte. Of course, it's color mapped because it's a label. It's not just a flat color. And I believe I have the same. Yep, everything's the same. And I just added the 15 to the glow. So they look like they're a similar type of matte finish. That's what I did there. So what I did for the color, I have it on a metal accurate right now. And now metal accurate can be like chrome. It's very intense. So I raised the ambient reflection and diffuse. I pulled that up because what I did is I took the reflectivity way off. That was up to like 90%. I put it back way off. That's why it's showing this subtle little checkerboard in here. It's showing me how much reflectivity. So I think if you go below 10, it turns off completely. And I think I'm going to demonstrate that later. Roughness is how shiny. So sometimes you can really pump that up and make it very shiny. So these are just some of the subtle adjustments I made here to get that shinier. So if I were to do this in plastic, and no adjustments. This is pretty stock. Let's just take a look at what that looks like. So you can see the white area is a little flatter. It's not bad. It looks quite nice because we have our lighting set up. We got a little backlight going on, so it's not bad. I wanted to accentuate those highlights and almost make it like a very smooth pigmented PET. Quite often opaque bottles are made of polyethylene, and polyethylene has sort of a inherent textured unevenness to the material. So what they do is for polyethylene, which would be like a milk container or laundry detergent bottle, they actually put a texture in the tool, a subtle texture all over the tool. And that's pretty standard. And that kind of hides the imperfections of polyethylene. So polyethylene with that subtle texture is sort of a matte. It does reflect light, but it's not very shiny. PET, on the other hand, is extremely smooth. PET is our clear water bottles and our clear bottles that look like glass. They're very shiny and very smooth. So if you take PET and you put a pigment in that, you can have a very shiny, solid, opaque bottle, which can be quite nice. It can almost look like a metallic metal. So it's quite nice. So I have plastic on here, and that's what that looks like. So I'm going to go back to my metal accurate. And since I didn't say it, it's saving all my settings. It didn't go back to default. So I have my reflectivity. So this is where I had it. So I'm going to render that right here so we can see the difference. So you can see my highlights. I know it's kind of subtle, but my highlights are wider, and I can even make this more reflective and make it almost look like a metal. So I'm suggesting sort of like a polished aluminum type of metallic feeling. And again, it's nice contrast to the matte of the closure and the label. And our backlighting looks really good. So that's that. So this is a color that I had picked. And we can control that color. If you're working on a graphic theme or you have a color for your brand, you can bring your RGB in here and put those numbers in exactly. I do this quite often when I'm working with a graphic designer and they have a particular color that's in the graphic and we want to make the bottle that color. They will send me the RGB colors and I can put that right in here and have that very accurate. The part that changes is when I start making it luminous and shiny and all that. And sometimes the designers will look at it like, well, that's not the same color. So yeah, it's the same color, but I made it very shiny. So it's a little bit of a negotiation on how all that's going to work. So by doing this, I have that color locked in. And the reason I'm talking about that is because I want to show you how I made this little texture map in this oval area. So what we have to do is I have to take that cube and I can duplicate it and put the texture in. If I already have that texture set up, I can organize, like sometimes I modified that color. So I had to go back and forth between these two. The same color here, I have it down here, duplicated, but I have a texture map in there. Let me talk about texture mapping. So this is the same color. You can see the color up here. And when I went back and forth, I made sure that these three numbers, the RGB, were exactly the same. So it's the same color. But I'm going to add a texture to this. So the metal accuracy, the reflectivity is the same. Color is exactly the same. But I added here under bump, there's a whole series of different types of texture mapping, casting cells. All of these things can be have the appearance of being inmolded into the material. So this is quite involved. I'm not going to go through all this, but you can experiment with how these work. I have it under rough. It's just this bumpy texture. Under rough, if you go with the options, it starts off at 100%, which is huge. A lot of these textures are set up for large environments like walls of buildings and things like that. So when we start working on our smaller objects, we have to bring that scale way down. So I have this at 0.5%, so that's very tiny. Amplitude talks about how bumpy, how deep these textures are. Detail is how involved they are. They can be very complex and very tight or very open and loose. And then sharpness can control if it has edges, like almost like sharp edges or very soft. I have sharpness very soft. I just want to, you can see the little sample of the texture. I just want to create a little bit of a bumpy area to suggest that that's where you might hold this bottle, that your hands are slippery. Detail, relatively simple. Um, Neutral on all of these is 0. So I'm very close to 0. So I did simple, it just renders quickly. I can do more complex and it'll eliminate any moire effects or anything. So that's the texture that I had set up. This is now a color. So when I put this on this model, it's not solid geometry. It's just a visual interpretation of what texture. This is only used for rendering. So for example, if I put that texture map on there and I save out this 3D data file for 3D printing, that texture will not be there in the 3D print. The 3D print is only reading real geometry. So I would have to build that texture to get that on there. Now, talking about that, that's really not how it works. I'm not going to build this tight little fine little texture. If I ever have a texture like this in a bottle that I want to produce, I show everybody renderings like this, and then I go to a company called Mold Tech. This is a little technical. After the tool has been made, Mold Tech is a company that will go in there and they will apply textures into the mold to my specifications in certain areas in the mold. So I don't have to build that geometry. So that's just a little nuance about some of the technical jargon. For rendering purposes, we're going to apply that. So I have it applied to that surface. So let's just talk about how this works. With that texture applied, go to color. You think of this as just a color, just like everything else that we apply, but this one has texture on it. We have two options here. It says I can keep everything the same and just color what I select, and I'll show you what that means, or you apply to the entire object. So I'm going to do entire object first, even though I have it selected there. And I go to color. It's going to put that texture on this entire bottle. So there's that texture all over the bottle. And this kind of striated effect that you see, it almost looks a little bit linear. That's because in my texture, I had it on simple. If I do it more complex, it'll even that texture out, but it'll take a little bit longer to render. And since I'm doing such a local area, ultimately, I'm not really worried about that. So that's one of the controls that you can work on. So this, to me, looks, it's like too much. It looks like this is a piece of charcoal or something. It's all over the place. But I think this texture in a local area can work really well. So that's texturing the entire bottle. So now I'm going to go back to my color. And I'm going to color the entire bottle back to where I was. So there it is. Now the texture came off of this little dome area. So I'm going to show you how to apply the texture just to that one part. So with your select tool, the pick tool, we're going to go to face. And I'm going to pick just that face. So that's illuminated. Go back to color and put our texture that we've created up in our materials with our color. And I want to color just that area. So if we go back up, don't deselect apply default texture, because that does the entire object. And you come down here and it says keep current material of faces. What they're trying to say is all the rest of the faces of this object, they're going to leave that alone. And we're going to apply the texture just to that part I selected. I could select other faces. I could select the faces in here, or I could select the faces outside of the dome and leave the dome shiny if I wanted. So I'm going to do it just to this internal area. And I just click in space. We can't see it until I go back into render zone, because texture maps, we only see in the clarity in render zone. So now I have that texture in there. It's the exact same color as the bottle, and it has the same reflective qualities as the bottle. So it is reflecting light, but we can see this nice little texture. So I think it's a nice little detail, a little focal point. It starts to suggest that maybe that's where you hold this bottle, that's where you squeeze it perhaps, or something like that. So that's the texture mapping detail. Again, you have to experiment with that and work with all those details. So another part of this rendering is the this floor or this counter area, this reflective surface that I have on the bottom. That's the same. It's just a flat two-dimensional disc. Doesn't have to be a disc. It's just a 2D surface that I put under the bottle. And I use the catcher under material parameters. If you double click on any of those cubes, I have a catcher selected under reflection. And like I had mentioned in the other tutorials, this catcher, all it does is shows shadows and reflectivity. It doesn't show color. We do have it on white. I could make it a color, and then you would see the shadows and intensity and the reflectivity in that color. But in this situation, I'm just going to leave this white because I want it to look more realistic. So I have those, again, pretty subtle, based on 100%. They're pretty small numbers. That's this surface on the bottom. I have that material on it. So now when we render, we'll get the reflectivity of the bottle, and we're going to get a little bit of a shadow. So I just want to point something out. That is a real panel in space. And since I have a reflective metal quality to the bottle, you can see this little line right here? It's very subtle. The bottle is reflecting that surface shining into the bottle, and we can see that little edge. Now, sometimes I use this panel to create reflections. It's almost like starting to build an environment. Sometimes I'll use that and reflect it into the bottle. This one particularly doesn't look very good. It's not helping with my design. And I don't need that because I have a lot of curves on this bottle. So I don't need any assistance with doing any kind of environment in here. So that is a little bothersome. So I wouldn't like that. So we have the floor. So what I can do is we can go back to that material. I probably only have to do it with our color. If you remember, I have this in metal accurate. So I'm going to go under my options. And you see reflectivity. I have that pretty low. So I believe if I go to 12 or under, it'll turn off reflectivity. Let's see. Let me just go to another one. No, it's still there. So I think I might have to go to 10. Okay, so I went to 10, and that little reflectivity of this black and white grid went away. So now I have no reflectivity. That will affect my lighting slightly. So to compensate, I'm going to pump up the brightness like a little bit, just to make it. I'm saying it's a little bit more shiny, but I turned off reflectivity. So we have control over these nuances. So now when I render this, I should have a nice highlight, and I should not see the reflectivity. Okay, I got rid of that, but my highlight is pretty soft now. It's getting a little bit more like plastic. I'm going to pump that up a little bit more. So let's pick, so a lot of these will make it more luminous. So I'm going to pump up on the specular. I think that'll make that highlight a bit stronger. Okay, so just by doing that, this got a little bit wider. Now what's happening is, you see my texture? My texture almost looks like it's a separate part sitting in there, because I changed the quality of this color and I didn't upgrade the texture in there. So this whole bottle is getting a little bit darker. It's not bad, a little grayer looking, but my texture looks foreign. Doesn't look like it's part of the same bottle. So I need to go back and make adjustments. And I didn't do it with the color. I did it with this reflective quality. So let's go into the metal reflector, and I'm going to try to memorize this. Sometimes I have to write this all down. So I have 12 for roughness, and I have 10 for reflectivity. And specular went up to 71, I believe. So I just need to remember 71, 10, and 12. So let's go to my texture map. Under metal accurate, and we had 71, 10, and 12. Okay, I think I remember that correctly. So now when I render this, that texture should feel like it's part. So okay, there we go. So now it feels like it's part of that bottle. It doesn't look like a separate part. So yes, by getting rid of that reflectivity, this whole bottle has become a little deeper and less bright. It's not bad. It's kind of a nice, rich, grayed out color with this reflective quality. So if I want to bring that back, I could go back into that metal accurate thing and pump up some of those other attributes, and I could get this brighter again. But I think you get the idea of how all this works. Okay, so that's this tutorial on rendering in solid plastic. We did talk about this whole background thing. So if we go under display options, under render zone, we have it under project color. And as you can see in my rendering, the top of my cap is almost disappearing. So it's getting flooded out by that hot light I have on the top. So to bring that back in, it can be helpful to put a background, a gradient background. So you see the top of that cap now? It's starting to come in. And this does give it a sense of reality by having this graduated background. And while I'm here, we can just talk about this for a second. So I have that gray that I usually put in there. We can do lots of things in there. That's this gray. I can pick any color I want. Just for demonstration purposes, let me just do a black so we can see a really dramatic background. So now that really looks like a classic seamless background, from the black coming all the way down to white with a reflectivity that really outlines the top of that cap so we can see that detail. Again, this could be colors, and you can actually use imagery and set up environments inside of that detail. Like I had mentioned, I don't use backgrounds too much. I like to keep it nice and clean. So when I trim it out, I can put these with other images and pages that don't have to deal with backgrounds. So quite often I'll leave it off. And in here, I have this in automatic down here at the bottom. So it's automatically updating whatever I do for the display options for render zone. Okay, that's it for this tutorial.